chapter 1. We left off last week around verses 4 and 5. Verse 4, we talked about that little statement in verse 4 where it says, and they lived there about 10 years. They lived there about 10 years. The length of stay in Moab is noted right there. If we have interpreted this passage accurately, then they moved there, and within 10 years of living there, Elimelech died, the husband, and the boys married, and they both died as well. The boys must have been close to marrying age when they left Bethlehem. Verses 11 and 12, and the reason why we say that is verses 11 and 12 indicate that Naomi is too old for bearing children, where it states there. And when Ruth does have a baby, other women encourage Naomi, saying, may he also be to you a restorer of life and a sustainer of your old age. That's stated in chapter 4 and verse 15. One of the themes of Ruth is the answer or the problem of an heir. So when hope seems gone for Naomi because of her old age, her husband has died, her boys have died, she has a daughter-in-law, Ruth, who is better to her than 7 sons, in chapter 4, in the second part of verse 15. Then tragedy strikes again in verse 5. I believe it is verse 5, yes. Tragedy this time strikes in a double portion. And again, the author relates these terse facts with no comment. There's no reference to punishment here. Well, they died because they moved to Moab, or they died because they married Moabite women. We've addressed that. There's nothing of that here. The author made a point from a contrast in verse 3 to verse 5. See, note verse 3, she was left with her 2 sons. Verse 5, the woman was bereft of her 2 children. So verse 3, she was left with her sons. Verse 5, she is left without her 2 children. So the loss of the boys is mentioned first because that was more recent. That's why they has that in verse 5. Now, the boys there, that's a noun, of course, and that noun usually designates a young child, not a grown man. But Naomi's boys were very dear to her, and the word that's used here also calls attention to her role as their mother. What I believe the author is doing here is communicating the tenderness of Naomi to her sons and the love that she has for her sons. Those are my boys. No matter how old they are, right? They're my boys. And when something happens to my boys, those are my boys. And it hits me, regardless of whether they're 10 or 40. They're my boys. So it's likely the reason why you have this noun here that's used that usually designates a young child. But her boys were very dear to her. This use of this word also signifies a theme of giving birth, which does play a prominent role later in the story in chapter 4 and verse 16, when Naomi is giving a new child, and the same word is used for that child. When Naomi's given that new child, it's the same noun used for her boys here in 1:5. So she has gone from having boys to having nothing, to now the Lord has given her a boy, an heir. That's one of the main things. That's the story here. God supplies. And how and why did they die? Were the deaths punishment for marrying Moabite women or for not returning to Israel? Or is this tragedy the birth pangs of some beautiful triumph of God? No. Elimelech's family hovers on the brink of extinction. We've talked about this. They needed to go. Elimelech thought that they were on the brink of starvation. They were in a famine. They got to a point where they thought that they had to go somewhere else or the family was going to starve. And if parents can do anything to provide food, they will. They're not going to watch their kids starve. In fact, that is in Kings and Chronicles, I don't recall which one, that kind of behavior is described as one of the punishments for Jerusalem. One of the punishments for Jerusalem is that, of course, the enemy is going to circle the city, so they're not going to let supplies go in or out. So all they got to do is sit there and wait till food runs out. And the prophets talk about you will eat your children because you're starving. And that's one of the punishments on the Jerusalem people in Jerusalem for abandoning the Lord. So they're not going to do that if they can help it. So poor Naomi has gone from wife to widow, from mother to being childless. Everything is gone. There is no identity for her. She is vulnerable to every kind of abuse physically and economically. And this being the case, her parents would probably be dead as well. She cannot return home to her father. So like Moses in Exodus 2:15, she is abandoned in a foreign land. One problem that this story will address and resolve is what will happen to a woman in Israel's patriarchal world. And God's providence is evident to anyone who has eyes to see here. But it's more than the text allows us to say that he is directly responsible for all that happens in this story. In other words, the evidence is not there to say that God is directly responsible for all that happens in the story. The author attributes two actions to God in this entire book. One, in verse 6 of chapter 1, then she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the land of Moab, for she heard in the land of Moab that the Lord had visited her people. That's one. And the other one is in chapter 4 and verse 13. Chapter 4 and verse 13, so Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife, and he went into her, and the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. Other than that, other than those two things, everything happens, and the Lord is not said to cause any of these things. So the tragic deaths of Elimelech and his sons should not be interpreted as acts of divine judgment, because there's not enough evidence in the context here or in the broader context of the Old Testament to sustain such a theory. On the contrary, it would seem that their deaths, like the famine and their move to Moab, are incidental details that set the stage for the story that follows, rather than the main themes that should drive one's interpretation of the story. So was it all really over but the crying, so to speak? What other impression is available from chapter 1 and verse 5? I mean, if you read chapter 1, verse 5, both Mahlon and Chilion also died. The woman was bereft of her two sons, of her two children, and her husband. That's a pretty bleak statement. What other impression is available after you read chapter 1, verse 5? What else are you going to think? Two funerals with no visible means of support. That doesn't leave a whole lot of encouragement there. But God is the hope of Israel. God is the hope of Israel. And when circumstances are hopeless, he is known to take a desperate situation and turn it into triumph. And we know, because we know the rest of the story, we know that God is going to do this. Truth is, God specializes in turning dead ends into doorways to glorify himself. And he's going to do this again. The fact that he is sovereign and committed himself to Israel is a bright ray of hope in the darkest of nights. In spite of Joseph's beatings and imprisonment, God intended all that for good, according to Genesis chapter 15 and verse 20. And though the making of many bricks was hard, it stirred God's compassion to rescue Israel from slavery in Exodus chapters 1, 2, and 3. That's what the beautiful story of Ruth is about. The comeback from the depths of despair through the door of the Lord's providential guidance and provision. And now, beginning at verse 6, this section here marks the first occurrence of the verb return. That verb return is It's prominent. It occurs a lot. Verse 6, verse 7, verse 8, verse 10, verse 11, verse 12, verse 15 twice. Verse 16, verse 22 twice. Return, 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 return. We're going back to the land. We're going back. So here you have in verses 6 through 19 the response to the crisis. Verses 6 through 19, the response to the crisis. Tragedy drives the remaining family home. And you have here in verses 6 through 19 the conversations en route back home. What they were, who reacts to them, and how they react. Now, the previous section, as you think about it in verses 1 through 5, there was no dialogue there. This was all the author telling us. It came about in the days when the judges judged, that there was a famine in the land. And there was a certain man in Bethlehem named Elimelech, and they were about to starve, and so they went to the land of Moab. And there in Moab, Elimelech died. And the two boys, Mahlon and Chilion, they took Moabite wives, but they died as well. Okay, no conversations, no dialogue. But this section is dominated with direct speech. Naomi and the two girls talk back and forth the whole time. Right? That's what girls do best. They talk. And that's what they're going to do. Go along the road and just talk and talk and talk. So the section is dominated by direct speech. The scene for the whole section is given in verses 6 and 7, and then we see them begin to work things out in verses 8 and following. So the author now relates certain incidents in considerable detail with no great leaps, which is uncharacteristic of verses 1 through 5. We have this happened and this happened and this happened, and they lived there 10 years. But now, instead of those broad statements, now we have considerable detail, no great leaps indicated by general statements. The characters are allowed to speak for themselves. So the tragedies of verse 5 have created a situation that's a bit unusual for Hebrew narrative. A woman, not a man, occupies the center stage, and on her wings are two more women. Of special interest is Ruth's emergence of incredible courage and commitment, and Naomi's growing acceptance of her daughter-in-law as a permanent part of her life. So the author said nothing about Naomi's grieving, but she was no different a wife and mother than any other wife and mother. No doubt she was grieving, she was hurting. There must have been grieving there on her part. And if we've interpreted the text correctly, Naomi has lost her husband and her two sons in a 10-year span of time. She was not just at the bottom of the barrel, so to speak, trying to sustain her existence without financial support of her husbands and sons. She had no means of doing so. Living in a foreign land with no boys or no husband for her. The barrel had fallen on her. Not only is she bottom of the barrel, but the barrel had fallen on her with overwhelming emotional force of finality and despair. So Moab, once a buoy of hope, those things that float, you hang on to it so you don't sink. Once Moab was a buoy of hope, was now a place of death. So Naomi's seemingly last glimmer of hope comes with news that, verse 6, the Lord had visited his people and giving them food. That's the first good news she's heard in a while. The Lord has visited his people. So in verses 6 through 9, you have the first exchange, and that's where we'll focus tonight. We won't go any further than that. Verses 6 through 9. The first exchange, Naomi and Ruth and Orpah go back and forth. So let's read verses 6 through 9. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law that she might return from the land of Moab, for she had heard in the land of Moab that the Lord had visited his people in giving them food. So she departed from the place where she was, and her two daughters-in-law with her. And they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. And Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return, each of you, to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. May the Lord grant that you may find rest, each in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. So this is all Naomi speaking here. And you note the prominence of Naomi. She becomes the subject here, as indicated by the main feminine singular verbs. She arose that she might return. She did all this. She departed the land of Moab, which is highly unusual in Hebrew. She was the head of her household at this point. Usually there's a male here, but Naomi takes center stage. Well, finally, there's a ray of hope. The reason for the return is stated, for she had heard. Apparently, in some way, some encouraging word reached Moab about the famine in Israel, and she heard about it. The Lord had visited his people, and in doing so had brought relief or had brought food. Now, the Targum, you've heard of a Jewish Targum. A Targum is a commentary, a Jewish commentary. And the older Targums, they have commentary on all of these things. In general, the Targums place the blame on Elimelech and Chilion and Mahlon. The Targums would say they died because they left the promised land. They died because they married Moabite women. Those are generally what the Targums are going to say. In fact, the Targum says that the way Naomi found out about this was that an angel informed her. Oh, that might be, but it's not in Scripture, and so we shouldn't go there. Somehow, some encouraging word reached Moab about the famine. She heard about it, and she recognized that the Lord has visited people in giving food. The word visited there is a classic term for divine remembrance. God visited means, in this context, to intervene on behalf of, or to come to the aid of, to visit graciously. And 1 Samuel chapter 2 and verse 21 is a good example of that, and it's only a couple of pages over. Listen to this. The Lord visited Hannah, and she conceived and gave birth. So you see that term, visited there, to intervene on behalf of, to come to the aid of, to visit graciously. That's what is communicated here. The providential hand of God is clearly at work. This is the first report, and only the first of 2 in the whole book, as we noted earlier, of direct action by God. And like the absence of details thus far, the cause of the relief is not stated. There's no mention of repentance by Israel or Naomi, but the condition of Israel during the time of the judges would lend some weight to seeing repentance on Israel's part. It would seem to be that way. We know the time of the judges was a circular kind of time where they enjoyed the blessings of obedience, then they strayed from God, then they were disciplined by a foreign army, and then God would deliver them, and it would cycle back and forth for a little over 300 years. But here there's no mention of repentance by Israel or Naomi or anything. Again, the Jewish Targums, they claim that the famine ends because of the merit and the petitionary prayer of the judge Ibzan, I-B-Z-A-N, in Judges chapter 12 and verse 8. Most of the Jewish Targums think that this happened during the time period that we would know as Judges chapter 12, around the judge Ibzan. Other commentators would place it more towards the end of the period of the judges. Later, when Naomi and Ruth are back in Bethlehem, we know that the crops are growing well. Chapter 2, verses 2 and 3 tell us that everything is going well. So what she heard was good. It was accurate. She responds to that. She knows that she has no way of making ends meet for her or her 2 daughters-in-law in Moab. And so her only hope she thinks her only hope is to go back to Israel. There's food back there. She has family back there, no doubt. She knows people back there. It would be a better opportunity for her, a better situation. And here we can note that 3 points of divine grace are evident. First of all, it was a gift from God for Naomi in the midst of her grief to hear about the relief. God always gives hope. God never lets us dangle with complete despair over the rocks below. So it was a gift from God that Naomi, in the midst of her grief, heard about the relief that God had visited his people. Number 2, the object of the divine favor is his people, the nation Israel. So the return of rain was an indication that God had not forgotten his people. And Naomi, no doubt, knew the scriptures, knew God's promise, knew of the Mosaic law. And number 3, the bread that had been absent from Bethlehem. In fact, the word Bethlehem, the word means house of bread, is being restocked. So all of this is encouraging news to her. How did she respond? 3 decisive verbs, we've mentioned these before, that express her response. She arose that she might return, and she departed. Those verbs express her decisiveness about getting back to Israel. So verse 7, she departed from the place where she was, her 2 daughters-in-law with her. They went on their way to the land of Judah. The verse records Naomi's actual departure from Moab. And the daughters-in-law, though traveling with her, they are grammatically subordinate. The main focus here is on Naomi. Naomi is still the subject, and she takes the initiative to leave. And what the author is writing, he's writing of these events from the perspective of an Israelite. The girls are not said to return because they're not from Israel. The girls are from Moab. The girls are not said to return. They're not said to hear of the word. They're not said to have set out. They are only with her. Technically, they are leaving their homeland for a foreign land, while Naomi is heading back home, which is going to make Ruth's response all the more wonderful when she says, I'm not going to leave you. Your God will be my God. Where you are, I will stay, which communicates a total abandonment from Ruth from everything that she has known before. So the singular subject suddenly changes here, and they went. She departed from the place where she was, and her 2 daughters-in-law with her, and now it changes. They went on their way. So they went, but the author purposely suggests ambiguity and uncertainty of the intention of the girls. In other words, the girls are pictured as tagging along, really not knowing where they're going. But Naomi is depicted as knowing precisely where she's going and why she's going there. But the girls are depicted as tagging along. So why are they following Naomi? Now we're prepared for the dialogue that follows in verses 8 through 17. Why are they following Naomi? Naomi will muster her most persuasive words to make the girls understand that following her would not be in their best interest. Just as she sees nothing for herself in Moab, she sees nothing for them in Israel. So we have verses 8 through the first part of verse 9. Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to her mother's house." And then wonderful statements, "May the Lord deal kindly with you." And in verse 9, "May the Lord grant that you may find rest." Wonderful statements that she makes for them. So as they're traveling along the road, the story depicts them going along the road. No doubt they must have been talking. I can't imagine that they walked a great distance without talking. And again, we don't know what route they're taking, whether they're going north over the northern edge of the Dead Sea, or whether they're going straight west, maybe south a little bit, and crossing the Dead Sea. It's at a very shallow place, and then moving north up to Bethlehem. We don't know. But Naomi, along the way, she broke the silence. Why? Well, commentators do not ask the question, Why did she break the silence? What was going on in her head that made her suddenly say in verse 8, Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-law, go return each of you to your mother's house. What? I thought they were coming with you. They're tagging along. Well, commentators do not ask the question. Maybe I shouldn't ask the question either. For example, one commentator says this, while en route, the 3 widows come to a crossroad in their lives when Naomi insists that her 2 daughters-in-law return home to Moab. Okay? Another commentator says this, Naomi's daughters-in-law set out for Judah with her, but an element of tension reappears as Naomi suddenly urges them to go back to Moab where they belong. Why? What's going on in her head? It seems as though, I think we're fairly safe to think Naomi's thinking in her head, what future do these girls have? 2 Moabite girls who have been married before, going to Israel, not back to Israel, but going to Israel, what future would they have? Who's going to take them as wives? Who's going to take a Moabite as a wife when there are plenty of women around there? Why would they do that? So she's thinking that there's just nothing here, girls, for you. She must have been thinking that. Was there a point of no return, so to speak, where Naomi made the appeal, go back now, beyond here, you'll be closer to Israel than Moab? Perhaps the girl's situation had been on her mind for a while, and she reached a decision that was best for them to go back home. The words here are spoken with tough love, so to speak. We use that term, tough love, meaning that they're not words that are easy to say, and you may not understand them, but it's what is best for you. So she spoke to the ladies with tough love, combining firmness with tenderness. And the nice thing is Naomi just didn't send them away and say, be blessed and give them some genuflecting or whatever. She didn't do that. She said twice, may the Lord deal kindly with you. And in verse 9, may the Lord grant that you may find rest. Those are really remarkable words. So Naomi is firm using a double command here, go and return. It conveys a sense of urgency. She says, girls, you need to turn around now. You've gone far enough. You need to turn around. Perhaps they had been talking about this for a little bit, and finally Naomi just reached a point where she turned around and said, you have to go back, girls. You need to go back. But she urged them to return each to her mother's house and appealed to reverse their personal histories. Go back to your mother's house, start over. Your husbands are dead, you're released from this marriage, go back to your mom's house, go back to your room that you grew up in, and start over. The reference to her mother's house is unusual, since widows normally return to their father's house. In Genesis 38 and Leviticus 22, Numbers 30, there are references of widows going back to their father's house. But here, the reference to her mother's house. The unusual phrase occurs, her mother's house, only in Genesis 24:28 and in Song of Solomon, chapter 3 and chapter 8. In each case, the phrase is found in a context involving love and marriage. So it seems that Naomi wishes the girls to return to their mother, which is their first responsibility. Their husbands have died, rather than stay with her, their mother-in-law. So her desire was to release the younger women from any obligations toward her. Perhaps she knew they felt an obligation because you're my husband's mother now, and my husband died, and I need to take care of you. Maybe that was the leanings of them. But she wishes to release them from any obligations to her, and also to free herself from any connection to her son's wives. I have no means of helping you. And she's going to go on and say, a little bit later in the chapter, you know this, you've read this, she's going to go on and say, are you going to wait? I'm going to go back to Bethlehem. Perhaps I'll marry and maybe have kids. You're going to wait till those boys grow up? You're going to wait 18, 20 years till these boys grow up before you marry them? No, my girls, go back home, start over. That's what's best for you, is what she says. So why does Naomi want the girls to return home? Does Naomi have the best intent for them? It seems so. The tenderness is expressed by a double blessing as well. We've noted this twice already. May the Lord deal kindly with you, and may the Lord grant you. The word kindly is the Hebrew word hesed, loving kindness. It's a covenant term, wrapping in itself all the positive attributes of God. In the word hesed, there is God's love and His covenant faithfulness and His mercy and His grace and His kindness and His loyalty, all wrapped up with that word, God's loving kindness. In Psalm 136, I believe it is, that word is mentioned numerous times, if I remember the correct psalm. Psalm 136, yes. You remember this psalm? Give thanks to the Lord, for He is good, for His loving kindness is everlasting. And it goes on for 26 verses, and the second line of all 26 verses is, for His loving kindness is everlasting. For His hesed is everlasting. That's the covenant term, all the positive attributes of God wrapped up with that. So may the Lord deal kindly with you. May Yahweh, the God of Israel, deal kindly with you. In short, to acts of devotion and loving kindness that goes beyond the requirement of duty, acts opposite of pain and grief. May the Lord deal kindly with you in this sense. And this is more than a casual goodbye and God bless you. It's much more than that. Naomi cites the reason in a simile, a comparative term, based on the girl's treatment of her and her two boys as, there's your simile, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. She obviously refers to the faithfulness of Ruth and Orpah, both to her and her two dearly departed boys, their husbands. So the statement, may the Lord deal kindly with you, is remarkable. Remarkable for three reasons. First, Naomi invokes the name of the Lord when she addresses Moabite women. The name of Yahweh, the God of Israel, in addressing their Moabite daughters-in-law. Apparently assuming that the authority of the God of Israel extended beyond the borders of Israel, which it does. We know that outside the borders of Israel, it's not promised, not the promised land. But Naomi evidently recognizes that God is not only the God of Israel, but He is the God who controls all things, even in Moab. On the surface, this prayer appears to express a deep faith in God, but is comprised or is compromised later in verse 15 when she gives implicit recognition to the gods of Moab. Down in verse 15, behold, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. We'll deal with that when we get there. Second of all, the blessings assume that God is interested in the affairs of this family and can be invoked to deal favorably with these Moabites. And third, Naomi recognizes the acts of kindness that Ruth and Orpah had performed on behalf of her and her two boys. She presents these Moabite women as models of grace for God Himself, is what she does. So here emerges a key theological assumption in the book that's here. The link between human action and divine action. In this case, human kindness has earned the possibility of a God-given reward. So far as they have shown kindness to the least of these Israelites, so may God show kindness to them. Remarkable statement. Well, the second blessing that she pronounces on them in verse 9, may the Lord grant to you, is a corollary to the first blessing. Literally, it reads, may Yahweh give to you and may you find security. That's what it says. The word grant means to bring about or cause to become. God is the one able to bring things about. She calls upon him to do so. That's Naomi's belief. He even controls human relationships. The word rest, he may give you rest, means settle down after moving or wandering. In essence, it connotes a permanence, a settlement, security, and freedom from anxiety after wandering, after uncertainty, and after pain. May he give you rest from the pain of losing your husbands. This is something that only God can give, and so Naomi seeks it for the girls. Her concern is that they be spared a life of restlessness and wandering, and that they may find a home in which they enjoy peace, permanence, and satisfaction of having their daily needs met. Not bad on Naomi's part. The rest that God may give is in the house of her husband. You notice that term, that statement in verse 9. Find rest each in the house of her husband. Now, she said the house of your mother's house earlier. Well, what does she mean by this? Naomi, of all people, knows that in a world in which they all live securely and experience well-being would be directly dependent upon a link with some male. To find this rest and peace and your needs met, all the supplies there, you need to be married. In that society in which she knew that, she knows that. She wasn't I don't know what the term would be these days. She wasn't racist. It was just the way, that's just the way it was. If a single woman living in this day and you don't have a husband, you barely have means of making money for your own food. You probably don't have a place to live. All your brothers, of course, according to Jewish law, your dad has to die, all your brothers have to die, and then you might get something. Well, Naomi only has two boys, and that's it. And they're both dead. So without Elimelech, she is without economic support, and without her husbands, these two girls are without support as well. Then she kissed them, and they lifted their voices and wept. As if to seal the separation securely, Naomi kissed the two young women goodbye. The kiss is a farewell gesture occurring primarily in context of lamentation and mourning. Literally, the phrase reads, and they all, that's all three women, wept and sobbed loudly. They just stopped on the road. She talked to them, and they all lifted their voices and wept and sobbed. They were a mess on the side of the road somewhere for a while as they talked with one another. It's still a common feature in Near Eastern expressions of grief. Naomi is convinced the best action for the girls is to return to their home. It's not an easy move. Adding to all that has happened, now she has decided to return home. The second exchange is between Naomi, and there is a little bit of, Orpah speaks a little bit, but Ruth is going to respond differently than Orpah, and that's in verses 10 through 14. And that'll be for next week. Of course, initially they say to her, no, but we will surely return with you to your people. Both of the girls at this point are saying, no, we want to go with you. We're with you. And then Naomi, as we noted earlier, she musters the best argument that she can, and she says, no, you have there's no hope for you there. And Orpah realizes, okay, you're right, I'll go back home. Ruth digs her heels in and says, no, I'm going with you. And Naomi says, okay, you come with me. But that is all for for next week, verses 10 through 14. Quite fascinating. And if you talk about the weeping and loudly sobbing, just watch the news sometime at a Syrian or Egyptian or any kind of Middle Eastern funeral. Watch the news clips of a Middle Eastern funeral, and you will see loud sobbing, wailing, very uncharacteristic according to our times, our culture around here. And you'll get an idea of lamentation, what happens, and these three ladies on the side of the road loudly sobbing because of all this. They're weeping openly, not guarded or anything. They're just blah. That was the culture. That is the culture there. Any questions? I hope this is enjoyable. I hope that it's encouraging. And through this, as we make an application every once in a while, but hopefully the Holy Spirit is making application in your own life at various points as we touch on some of the details here. The Lord will be moving in your own life, making you remember the past, making you think about things you wish you would have done, and maybe resolving to do things differently in the future. And that's good. All of that is good. No questions? Oh, Lord God, thank you